Imagine this: a silent battle you've been fighting for years, one that consumes your thoughts, distorts your actions, and leaves you feeling empty and alone. It's a cycle of guilt and despair, where no matter how much you try to break free, the chains seem tighter. Maybe you've convinced yourself it's harmless, that it's just a part of life. But deep down, there's a whisper, a persistent voice, telling you that something is deeply wrong. That whisper grows louder with every passing day, filling you with questions, fears, and doubts about where this path might lead. What if I told you this hidden struggle is not just about you? What if it's something that millions battle in silence, afraid to face the truth? Padre Pio, the revered saint known for his wisdom and uncompromising stance on sin, once said, "Sin blinds the soul. It prevents us from seeing the light of God." And this particular sin he warned about, he called it a silent destroyer, a trap that can rob you of your peace, your purpose, and even your salvation. You might be wondering, is it really that serious? Perhaps you've justified it, saying it's natural, normal, or harmless. But have you noticed how it's affected your relationships? How it has stolen your focus, your joy, your ability to connect with others, and most importantly, with God? You've probably felt the weight of it. The shame, the secrecy, the isolation. It feels like a prison, doesn't it? One where you're the only inmate and the only jailer. But here's the truth that most people won't tell you. You're not alone. You're not beyond hope. And this sin, no matter how strong its grip on your life, can be defeated. Padre Pio's teachings provide a roadmap, a guide to breaking free from this cycle, reclaiming your life, and restoring your connection with God. It's not easy, but it's possible. Through discipline, faith, and the power of grace, countless souls have found freedom and joy after years of struggle. Think about this for a moment. What if today was the turning point? What if this very moment was God's way of calling you to something greater, to a life free from the burden you've been carrying? You don't have to keep walking this path alone. You don't have to let it define you. There is a way out, and the solution might be closer than you think. Stay with me, because in just a moment, I'm going to reveal the disturbing truth Padre Pio shared about this sin and why it's so dangerous. I'll show you exactly how you can overcome it step by step, with tools that are not only practical, but also rooted in divine wisdom. This could be the moment you've been waiting for, the moment that changes everything. If you're ready to uncover the truth and take the first step toward freedom, don't go anywhere. But before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll explore life-changing stories, spiritual wisdom, and the tools you need to overcome life's greatest challenges. Don't miss what's coming next. It might just be the answer you've been searching for. Ethan was a man like many others, ambitious, kind-hearted, and full of dreams. On the surface, his life seemed perfectly fine. He had a steady job, good friends, and a family who loved him. But beneath the mask of normalcy lay a hidden struggle, one that he didn't dare to speak of. It was a habit he had developed years ago, a habit that felt harmless at first, but slowly began to take root in his life, consuming parts of him he didn't even realize he was losing. It was private, something he justified as normal, even as it started to affect the way he saw himself, his relationships, and his connection with God. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it. Everyone has their vices, right? But over time, he began to notice something unsettling. He felt a growing emptiness, a restlessness that no amount of work, entertainment, or even prayer seemed to fill. He would sit in church and listen to the readings, but they felt distant, like words spoken, in a language he could no longer understand. His prayers became rushed, mechanical, and guilt-ridden, as though he were simply checking a box to keep God at bay. And the more he tried to ignore it, the louder the silence in his soul became. Ethan began to notice subtle shifts in his life. His once deep conversations with friends became shallow. His relationships lacked authenticity, as though there was always a barrier between him and the people he loved. And worst of all, his sense of purpose started to fade. He no longer felt the fire of ambition or the joy of working towards something greater than himself. He was stuck in a loop, going through the motions, yet feeling further and further away from the person he knew he was meant to be. One evening, while scrolling through the internet, he stumbled upon a quote by Padre Pio. It was simple yet piercing. "This sin destroys your soul and distances you from God's grace." At first, Ethan brushed it off. He had read similar things before and he didn't think it applied to him. But the words stayed with him, echoing in his mind like a haunting melody. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a truth here he had been avoiding. The more he thought about it, the more he began to see how deeply his hidden struggle had infiltrated his life. For the first time, Ethan started to connect the dots. The guilt he carried, the spiritual emptiness, the emotional walls he had built, they all pointed back to the same source. He realized that his habit wasn't just a private issue, it was a barrier, a wall separating him from God's love and the life he was meant to live. It was like a poison, slowly seeping into every corner of his soul, numbing him to the beauty and purpose of life. Ethan felt a wave of fear and sadness wash over him. How had he let it get this far? He thought of all the times he had ignored the gentle nudges of his conscience, the moments when he had chosen fleeting pleasure over lasting peace. He felt like the prodigal son, standing in the filth of his choices, longing to return to his father's house but unsure if he was worthy. Yet even in his fear, there was a glimmer of hope. If Padre Pio had spoken so strongly about this sin, it meant there was a way out. There had to be a path back to grace. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He began searching for more about Padre Pio's teachings, diving into stories of the saint's life and his unyielding commitment to helping souls find their way to God. He read about the power of confession, the importance of prayer, and the need for discipline in overcoming sin. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a spark of something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him. As Ethan sat in the quiet of his room, the words of Padre Pio resonated in his heart. The devil will make you believe there is no hope, but do not listen. It was as though the saint himself was speaking directly to him, cutting through the fog of shame and doubt that had clouded his mind for so long. Ethan realized he had been living in denial, afraid to face the truth because he feared it would condemn him. But in that moment, he understood something profound. The truth wasn't there to condemn him. It was there to set him free. If you've ever felt this way, trapped, unworthy, or unsure if you can find your way back, you're not alone. Ethan's story is one that many of us can relate to, whether we admit it or not. But here's the good news. No matter how far you've strayed, no matter how heavy the burden you carry, there is always a way back. Padre Pio's teachings remind us that God's mercy is greater than any sin, and His grace is always available to those who seek it. Before we continue Ethan's journey and uncover the steps he took to confront his struggle and reclaim his life, I want to invite you to join this community by subscribing to this channel. Together we explore stories of transformation, lessons from saints like Padre Pio, and practical ways to overcome the challenges we face in our spiritual lives. And while you're here, let me ask you, what part of Ethan's story resonates with you the most so far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's dive deeper into how Ethan began his path to freedom. Stay with me. You won't want to miss what comes next. Ethan's discovery of Padre Pio's teachings had been like a flashlight flickering on in a dark cave, exposing shadows he hadn't dared to confront. But that initial moment of realization was just the beginning. The deeper Ethan delved into Padre Pio's warnings, the more he began to understand the gravity of what he was facing. The saint's words weren't just meant to frighten, they were meant to awaken. And awakened Ethan was, though what he now saw left him uneasy. As Ethan read more, he came across one of Padre Pio's sternest cautions. Sin blinds the soul. It prevents us from seeing the light of God. The phrase struck him like a thunderclap. Was this why he had been feeling so lost, so disconnected from God? He started to piece together the puzzle. His habit, something he had dismissed as trivial, had been quietly eroding his spiritual vision. It wasn't just about guilt or shame. It was about the way his choices had dulled his ability to see God's presence in his life. He began reflecting on his past, combing through memories with a newfound awareness. He thought about the times he had been quick to anger, distant from loved ones, or uninterested in prayer. He remembered the occasions when he had chosen comfort over courage, avoiding the hard truths of life because they seemed too overwhelming. In every instance, Ethan now saw the fingerprints of his habit. It was like a veil had been pulled over his soul, making him blind to the joy and purpose God had placed before him. One night, Ethan stumbled across a story from Padre Pio's life that shook him to his core. A man had once confessed to Padre Pio about a seemingly minor sin, dismissing it as insignificant. But the saint's response was anything but casual. With piercing eyes and a heart full of compassion, Padre Pio told the man that even the smallest sins, if left unchecked, could grow like weeds, choking the soul and making it harder to hear God's voice. Ethan felt as though those words were meant for him. He realized that his habit wasn't just a physical act, it was a spiritual choice that had ripple effects far beyond what he could see. The more he read, the clearer the stakes became. Padre Pio spoke often about how sin creates a kind of spiritual numbness, a blindness that makes us indifferent to God's love. Ethan felt this truth deeply. How many times had he sat through Mass, hearing the gospel but feeling nothing? How often had he prayed half-heartedly, distracted and distant as though God were a stranger? He began to see how his habit had dulled his heart, making it harder for him to experience the peace and joy that came from being in God's presence. But what truly terrified Ethan were Padre Pio's warnings about eternity. The saint had spoken openly about how sin, if unrepented, could sever a soul's relationship with God. This wasn't just about feeling distant from God in this life. It was about risking eternal separation from Him in the next. The thought of that was almost too much for Ethan to bear. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest as he considered what was at stake. This wasn't just a bad habit or a moral failing, it was a threat to his very soul. Ethan's fear, however, wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of his desperation for change. He didn't want to live like this anymore. He didn't want to be blind to God's love or risk losing the gift of eternal life. But the question remained, how? How could he break free from something that had held him captive for so long? The fear of failing, of trying and falling back into old patterns was almost paralyzing. And yet, Ethan felt a small but persistent hope flicker within him. If Padre Pio believed that freedom was possible, maybe it truly was. Ethan began to pray, not perfectly, not without distractions, but with sincerity. He found himself whispering to God, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know where to start. But I need you. Please help me." It wasn't much, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt as though he wasn't alone in his struggle. He realized that the first step toward freedom wasn't about fixing himself, it was about surrendering to God's grace. As he continued to learn from Padre Pio's teachings, Ethan came across another piece of advice that gave him hope. Padre Pio often encouraged people to go to confession, not as a ritual or obligation, but as a powerful encounter with God's mercy. Ethan had avoided confession for years, afraid of the shame he might feel in speaking his sins out loud. But now, he saw it differently. This wasn't about shame, it was about healing. Padre Pio had said that confession was like a cleansing fire, burning away the chains of sin and restoring the soul to its original beauty. Ethan decided that he would go, no matter how hard it felt. In the days leading up to his confession, Ethan felt a mix of emotions, fear, relief, and an unexpected sense of anticipation. He knew it wouldn't be easy to face his sins head-on, but he also knew that this was the path to freedom. As he prepared, he thought about all the times he had let his habit dictate his choices, all the moments when he had chosen darkness over light. He didn't want to live that way anymore. He wanted to see clearly again, to feel the warmth of God's love in his life. Ethan's story, though deeply personal, is one that resonates with so many of us. We all have areas of our lives where we feel stuck, where we've allowed sin to take root and blind us to the goodness around us. But like Ethan, we're not without hope. Padre Pio's teachings remind us that no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how heavy our burdens, God's grace is always available to us. The journey might be difficult, but the reward is worth it. A soul that is free, a heart that is open, and a life that is fully alive in God's love. Now it's your turn. Have you ever felt the kind of spiritual blindness Ethan experienced? What do you think about Padre Pio's teachings on how sin can affect our souls? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this message resonates with you. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll continue exploring stories like Ethan's, uncovering truths that can transform our lives and bring us closer to God. Stay tuned, there's so much more to come. Ethan sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the ceiling as the weight of his choices pressed down on him like an invisible burden. The walls around him seemed to close in, suffocating and cold, as though they bore witness to the inner chaos he was unable to escape. For weeks now, he had been spiraling deeper into a pit of guilt and shame, unable to muster the strength to even look at himself in the mirror. His once strong faith felt like a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing sense of unworthiness that left him feeling estranged from God. He hadn't been to church in months. The idea of stepping into a sacred space, surrounded by people who seemed to have their lives together, filled him with dread. What would they think of him if they knew? What would God think of him? These questions haunted him daily, robbing him of peace. Ethan felt trapped, stuck in a vicious cycle of sin and regret. Each time he fell back into his old habits, the shame was worse than before. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the way it left him feeling afterward. Hollow, broken, and miles away from the person he wanted to be. Late one night, as he sat alone in the silence, Padre Pio's words came rushing back to him. The devil will try to make you believe there is no hope, but do not listen. Ethan had read those words weeks ago during one of his desperate searches for answers, but now they echoed in his mind with a clarity that startled him. No hope. That was exactly how he felt. It was as though an unseen force had been whispering those words into his heart, trying to convince him that he was beyond redemption. And for a moment he realized he had been listening. This was the crisis. Not just the sin itself, but the lie he had allowed to take root in his soul. That his sin was too great, his mistakes too numerous, and his heart too damaged for God to heal. It was a lie that had grown stronger with every passing day, fed by his feelings of failure and the heavy weight of shame. Ethan felt as though he had been walking through a dark forest without a map, stumbling over roots and branches, unable to find his way out. And yet, something within him resisted. Maybe it was the faint memory of the joy he had once felt in God's presence, or perhaps it was the stubborn hope that Padre Pio's words might actually be true. Whatever it was enough to keep him from giving up entirely. Ethan decided to take a small, trembling step forward. He dusted off his Bible, which had been sitting untouched on his bookshelf, and opened it to the first page he could find. His eyes landed on the story of the prodigal son. As Ethan read, tears began streaming down his face. The story felt like it had been written just for him. Here was a young man who had squandered everything, who had reached the lowest point of his life, and yet, when he returned home, his father ran to him with open arms. Ethan could barely see the words through his tears, but the message was clear. No matter how far he had fallen, God was waiting for him with love and forgiveness. But knowing this truth and acting on it were two very different things. Ethan knew he needed to change, but the thought of facing his sins head-on was terrifying. He had spent so much time hiding from God, avoiding prayer and confession, that the idea of stepping back into the light felt impossible. What if he failed again? What if he confessed his sins, only to fall back into the same patterns? These fears kept him paralyzed, teetering on the edge of despair. One night, as he lay awake, Ethan remembered something else Padre Pio had said. Pray, hope, and don't worry. Worry is useless. God is merciful and will hear your prayer. Those words, so simple yet profound, began to sink into his heart. Ethan realized that he had been trying to carry the burden of his sins alone, relying on his own strength to break free. But Padre Pio's advice reminded him that he wasn't meant to fight this battle by himself. God's mercy wasn't something he had to earn. It was a gift, freely given to those who asked for it. For the first time in months, Ethan got down on his knees and prayed. It wasn't a perfect prayer. His voice shook, and his words came out haltingly, but it was real. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know where to start, but I need you. Please, help me." As he spoke, he felt a strange sense of relief, as though a small part of the weight he had been carrying had been lifted. In the days that followed, Ethan began to take small steps toward healing. He reached out to a trusted friend from his church, someone he knew wouldn't judge him but would offer support and guidance. He started praying daily, even when it felt awkward or forced, and most importantly, he made the decision to go to confession. The night before his confession, Ethan was a bundle of nerves. He had written down everything he wanted to say, but the thought of actually speaking those words out loud filled him with anxiety. What if the priest judged him? What if he couldn't get through it? But as he walked into the confessional the next day, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The priest's voice was kind and compassionate, and as Ethan confessed his sins, he felt the chains of shame begin to fall away. When the priest gave him absolution, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. It wasn't just the absence of guilt. It was the presence of grace. He walked out of the church that day with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to live a life that honored God. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Ethan's story is one of struggle, but it's also one of redemption. It's a reminder that no matter how far we've fallen, God's mercy is always within reach. If you've ever felt trapped in a cycle of sin or shame, know that you're not alone. Like Ethan, you can take that first step toward healing. It starts with a simple prayer, an honest conversation with God, and the willingness to believe that His love is greater than any mistake you've made. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt the way Ethan did? Trapped, ashamed, and unsure of how to move forward? What helped you find hope and healing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone else who's struggling. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more stories and insights that can help you grow in faith and overcome life's challenges. Together, we can support one another on this journey. Stay tuned. There's so much more to discover. Ethan stood at the church's doors, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt heavy, like the weight of every mistake he'd ever made was pressing down on him. He'd walked past this very building countless times, always telling himself he'd step inside someday. But that day never seemed to come. Until now. Padre Pio's words had been echoing in his mind for weeks. Do not let the devil convince you that you're beyond saving. Go to confession. Start anew. Ethan knew he couldn't keep running from his guilt. If he wanted to change, it had to begin here. As he stepped inside, the cool stillness of the church greeted him. The flickering candles and soft light gave the space a sense of peace Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. But his mind was anything but peaceful. His palms were sweaty, and he could barely focus. The idea of laying bare his darkest sins to another person, even a priest, terrified him. What would the priest think of him? Would he judge him? Would he be disappointed? The confession booth loomed ahead, a small wooden structure that seemed larger than life in Ethan's mind. He swallowed hard, unsure if he could go through with it. But something kept him moving forward, a faint glimmer of hope that this could be the turning point he desperately needed. He stepped into the booth, knees trembling, and the screen slid open. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. He could hear his own breath shaking. The priest's voice came through, calm and kind. "Take your time, my son. God is ready to hear your heart." Ethan took a deep breath, gripping his hands together tightly. He started to speak, hesitantly, at first, but as he went on, the words poured out of him like water breaking through a dam. He confessed everything: the shame, the guilt, the habits he'd tried and failed to break, and the way he distanced himself from God because he felt unworthy. Every word felt like a small weight being lifted off his shoulders, though the I process was painful. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down his face. The priest didn't respond immediately. There was a brief silence, one that made Ethan's heart race. But when the priest finally spoke, his words were not of judgment but of compassion. "Ethan," the priest said, "there is no sin too great for God's mercy. What you've done today is an act of courage. By coming here, you've taken the first step back into God's grace. Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about perseverance. And God is walking this journey with you." As the priest absolved him, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like a heavy chain had been broken. For the first time in years, he felt free. The guilt that had haunted him was replaced with a newfound clarity, a sense that he could finally start fresh. But the priest's guidance didn't end there. He gave Ethan practical advice, something to anchor his newfound commitment. To stay strong, you need a plan. Begin each day with prayer. Pray the rosary daily. Meditate on Christ's suffering to understand the price of redemption. Consider fasting, even in small ways, as a way to strengthen your will against temptation. And never be afraid to return to confession if you stumble. This is a journey, not a one-time event. Ethan left the church that day with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He didn't just want to avoid sin. He wanted to rebuild his life on a foundation of faith and devotion. The priest's words rang in his ears. Pray the rosary daily. That very evening, Ethan found a dusty rosary tucked away in a drawer, a forgotten gift from his grandmother. He sat down, unfamiliar with the prayers but determined to learn. As he prayed, something stirred within him, a sense of connection, as though he were finally speaking to God again after years of silence. The days that followed were far from easy. Temptation didn't disappear overnight. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger, as though testing his resolve. But Ethan was prepared. Whenever he felt the familiar pull of his old habits, he turned to prayer. He'd pause, hold the rosary in his hands, and remind himself why he was fighting. He began fasting on Fridays, skipping a meal as a small sacrifice to remind himself of Christ's suffering. It wasn't much, but it gave him strength. Ethan also made time for reflection, reading passages from the Bible that spoke of God's mercy and forgiveness. He was particularly drawn to the story of St. Peter, who had denied Christ 3 times yet was still forgiven and chosen to lead. If God could forgive Peter, Ethan thought, then surely there was hope for him too. Over time, these practices became a routine, a source of stability in his life. He started to notice subtle changes, not just in his habits, but in his heart. He felt more patient, more aware of God's presence in his daily life. He began to see his struggles not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to grow closer to God. One evening, as Ethan knelt in prayer, he realized something profound. His fight against sin wasn't just about avoiding temptation. It was about filling the empty spaces in his heart with something greater. His journey wasn't just about what he was leaving behind. It was about what he was moving toward, a life centered on God. Months later, Ethan found himself back in the same church, kneeling before the altar. This time, he wasn't weighed down by guilt. Instead, he was filled with gratitude. He thought back to where he'd started, to the moments of despair when he thought there was no hope. And yet, here he was, living proof that God's mercy could transform even the darkest moments into something beautiful. Ethan's story is a testament to the power of grace and the importance of perseverance. His journey wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it showed him that redemption isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, trusting in God's mercy, and taking one step at a time. If Ethan's story resonates with you, I want to encourage you to take that first step just like he did. Maybe it's praying the rosary for the first time in years. Maybe it's going to confession or reaching out to someone who can guide you. Whatever it is, know that it's never too late to turn back to God. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment of transformation like Ethan? What helped you take that first step toward change? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your words might just inspire someone else who's struggling. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll join a community of people striving to grow in faith and overcome life's challenges together. Hit that button, and let's walk this journey side by side. Stay tuned. There's so much more to come. As Ethan continues on his journey of transformation, he realizes that change isn't immediate. It's not something that happens in a single moment, but rather in the small, consistent decisions he makes every day. When he first started seeking redemption, he felt like an outsider in his own life. He saw the distance between himself and the man he wanted to be. But now, with the weight of guilt gradually lifting, he begins to grasp a profound truth. Real change requires patience, perseverance, and above all, grace. The teachings of Padre Pio were no longer just words he read in passing or pondered in fleeting moments of doubt. They became a lifeline for Ethan, something he clung to with unwavering determination. When temptation crept in, when the old habits and urges whispered in the back of his mind, Ethan learned to face them differently. He could no longer rely solely on willpower, for he had tried that before, and it always led to failure. This time, it had to be different. Padre Pio's words had struck him deeply. Prayer is the best weapon we have. It is the key to God's heart. Prayer wasn't just a way to ask for forgiveness or strength. It was the way to reconnect with God, to realign his heart and soul with divine love. Each time he faced temptation, Ethan transformed those moments into opportunities for prayer. He didn't allow himself to succumb to the shame or the guilt. Instead, he used those feelings as a prompt to turn to God for help. His mind would race with negative thoughts, but he forced himself to focus, to recite a prayer, even if it was just the Our Father or a simple plea for strength. These moments of temptation became his practice ground, where he could exercise discipline and trust in God's power to deliver him. As he prayed, he felt the pull of temptation slowly lose its strength. His feelings of weakness turned into opportunities for growth. Each time he succeeded in resisting, he gained a little more confidence. And when he faltered, he didn't let it destroy him. Instead, he turned it into a learning experience, reminding himself that perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was. The change Ethan was experiencing wasn't just internal. His external life started to reflect his commitment to transformation. His relationships improved. He had always been distant from his friends and family, but now, as he became more focused on his spiritual life, his interactions became more genuine. He sought to be a better friend, a better son, a better man. His newfound discipline spilled into every area of his life: work, home, social interactions. He wasn't perfect, but he was striving towards something greater. Ethan began to see his daily practices as his armor against temptation. The prayer he said each morning became a shield, and his fasting, a weapon in his spiritual arsenal. The simple act of praying the rosary each day brought a deep peace to his heart. At first, the prayers felt like a struggle, words that didn't flow easily, thoughts that wandered. But over time, the ritual became sacred. He found comfort in the repetition. He clung to the mysteries of the rosary, reflecting on the moments of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. The spiritual discipline of prayer became an anchor in his life, keeping him grounded when everything around him seemed to be slipping. Fasting was another tool in his growing spiritual toolbox. Initially, he fasted as a way to fight against the pull of temptation, but it gradually became more than that. It became a form of penance, a way for him to offer his struggles to God. The physical discomfort of fasting served as a reminder of Christ's suffering, and in that, Ethan found solace. Each time he fasted, he felt closer to the reality of Christ's sacrifice. He didn't see his discipline as a way to earn God's favor. Instead, it was a way of humbling himself, recognizing the gap between his weaknesses and the divine grace he so desperately needed. Even in his darkest moments, Ethan had learned to transform his feelings of guilt into motivation. He knew the journey to holiness wouldn't be quick, but each day brought him closer to the man he wanted to be. He understood that grace was not just a one-time gift. It was an ongoing invitation to grow closer to God, a constant renewal of God's love and mercy in his life. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be faithful, to commit each day to his growth in faith and to rely on God's strength rather than his own. Ethan's journey was not without setbacks. There were moments when his discipline wavered, times when he questioned if it was worth it. But through it all, he held on to the truth that Padre Pio had taught him. The path to redemption was not linear. There would be ups and downs, but each setback didn't mean failure. It meant there was still work to be done, and God was with him every step of the way. Over time, Ethan's relationship with God deepened. He began to see his prayers not as mere words, but as an intimate conversation with the divine. He knew that God didn't just want him to avoid sin. God wanted him to draw near, to experience the transformative power of love. The more he prayed, the more he felt God's presence in his life, and the more his desires shifted. What once seemed like an insurmountable struggle now felt like a daily choice to align his will with God's. As Ethan's heart was transformed, so was his life. His work became an opportunity to glorify God. His relationships, once fractured and distant, grew stronger, more loving. He became a source of light to those around him, not because he was perfect, but because he was committed to the truth that God's grace was more than enough. Ethan knew that his journey wasn't over. He would continue to face challenges, to fight temptation, but he no longer felt powerless. He had the tools he needed: prayer, discipline, and most importantly, grace. He had come to realize that victory wasn't in his own strength, it was in God's. And with God's grace, anything was possible. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment where prayer and discipline became your weapons against temptation? How have you found strength through spiritual practices like prayer and fasting? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. If you found this story inspiring and want more content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll join a community of people seeking growth, support, and a deeper connection with God. Let's continue this journey together. Thank you for being a part of this community, and I can't wait to share more with you soon. Ethan's journey of transformation had not been an easy one. It was a path marked by struggles, moments of doubt, and many temptations. But as he emerged victorious, his soul finally felt the peace and joy he had longed for. For so long, he had been trapped in the darkness of sin, unable to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But now, as he looked back, the distance he had traveled was clear. He had learned that no matter how deep the darkness, God's grace could bring anyone into the light. Ethan's heart was now filled with gratitude, not just for his own personal victory, but for the deep understanding that he had gained. He realized that he had not only overcome his struggles with temptation, but he had also been gifted with the tools to help others. His experiences, though painful, had given him a unique perspective, a living testimony of what happens when a person surrenders their heart to God and allows His grace to guide them. He knew that his story was not just his own. It was part of a much greater narrative, a story of God's mercy and the power of redemption. He couldn't keep it to himself. His transformation had to be shared, not just for his own healing, but for the healing of others who were suffering in silence just as he had. He began speaking to anyone who would listen about his journey, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the incredible power of God's love to redeem even the most broken heart. Ethan didn't want to just preach words. He wanted to live out the truth he had discovered. Every action, every decision he made now reflected the changes that had taken place within him. His life became a living testimony to the power of God's grace. As he began to help others, his life became more than just an individual story of salvation. It became a beacon of hope for anyone who was lost and seeking redemption. But his message wasn't just about speaking to people, it was about showing them. He didn't want to be someone who merely told others to do something he hadn't done himself. Instead, he walked the path of redemption every single day, demonstrating, through his own actions, what it meant to live a life of faith, discipline, and grace. He knew that the truth revealed to him through Padre Pio, no sin was too great for God's mercy, but ignoring it could destroy a person's soul, was something he had to embody. As Ethan continued to grow in faith and spiritual understanding, he began reaching out to others who were struggling in similar ways. He realized that so many people around him were dealing with their own struggles in silence, afraid to speak out or seek help. He started mentoring people, offering them the same wisdom that Padre Pio had imparted to him. And what he discovered was incredible. By sharing his testimony, he wasn't just helping others find healing, he was healing himself. With each person he helped, Ethan's faith deepened, and the peace he had found in his own life grew stronger. He knew now that his purpose wasn't just to overcome his past mistakes, it was to help others do the same. It was to share the message that no matter what sin had plagued their lives, they could always return to God and find healing. It was a message of hope, of restoration, of unshakable love. His story became a powerful tool in the hands of God. It reached beyond just those he met personally. His testimony spread far and wide, touching the lives of people in ways he had never imagined. Ethan wasn't looking for fame or recognition. What mattered to him was the fact that others were hearing the truth and finding freedom. As Ethan continued to dedicate his life to helping others, he found that his own understanding of God's grace only grew deeper. Every time someone came to him for guidance or shared their struggles, he saw more clearly how much God's love extended to all people. His life had been transformed, but now he was able to help others transform theirs. Through it all, Ethan's heart remained humble. He never saw himself as perfect or above others. Instead, he saw himself as a vessel of God's mercy, a living example of how the love of God could heal even the most broken of hearts. His life became a testimony that no matter how far someone has fallen, God's grace is always available to lift them up. And this was the core of the message Ethan carried with him every day. There is no sin too great for God's mercy. No matter how deep the darkness, no matter how far someone has strayed, God's love is always greater. The only thing that can truly separate a person from that love is the choice to ignore it and remain in the darkness. But even then, God is patient, waiting with open arms for anyone willing to return. Ethan had been the prodigal son. He had wandered far from the path of righteousness. But like the father in the parable, God had welcomed him back with open arms. And now Ethan was doing the same for others. His life, once lost in the chaos of sin, was now a beacon of hope, a testimony of what is possible when a heart opens to the grace of God. His journey wasn't over. Every day he still fought temptation, still sought growth and deepening faith. But he no longer faced it alone. He had found strength in prayer, in discipline, and in the support of others who shared the same journey. With each passing day, Ethan's heart became more aligned with God's will, and with that alignment came the unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are walking the path God has laid out for you. As Ethan reflected on his life, he was reminded of the words of Padre Pio. No sin is too great for God's mercy. He had lived those words, and now he saw them as the key to his own peace. He had been lost, but now he was found. And his life, once consumed by darkness, now radiated with the light of God's love and grace. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where you felt lost, but then discovered the power of God's grace to transform your situation? How has God's mercy shaped your journey? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share your thoughts and experiences with us. Your testimony could be the encouragement someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonates with you, and you want to continue receiving uplifting and powerful content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Join our community, and let's continue walking this journey together, growing in faith and love. Thank you for being a part of this channel, and I look forward to sharing more with you soon. As we come to the end of this powerful journey, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned and experienced together. Throughout this video, we've walked alongside Ethan, a man who was once lost in the trap of sin, particularly the destructive cycle of temptation that so many struggle with in silence. His story, though challenging, is a testament to the transformative power of God's grace and the healing that comes from opening our hearts to Him. Ethan's journey began with a shocking realization, the understanding that his actions were not just a small matter, but something that had affected his relationship with God and his very soul. He found, just as many of us do, that sin has a way of creeping into our lives without us even realizing how deeply it is affecting us. But through Padre Pio's teachings, Ethan was able to confront the truth of his situation. The turning point came when he acknowledged his guilt and his brokenness. The words of Padre Pio echoed in his mind, reminding him that no sin was too great for God's mercy. It was in that moment of crisis, of breaking, that Ethan realized the path to redemption was not through hiding or running away from his struggles, but through facing them head-on with faith and the courage to change. Through confession, prayer, and the discipline of daily spiritual practices, Ethan began to reclaim his life. He fought temptation, not in his own strength, but with the help of God's grace. His testimony is a powerful reminder that no matter how far we've fallen, there is always a way back. God is always waiting for us to return to Him. What Ethan experienced is something that many of us can relate to. We all face struggles and moments where we feel lost or unworthy of God's love. But the message here is clear. No sin is too great for God's mercy. The key to redemption lies in acknowledging our sin, seeking forgiveness, and allowing God's grace to transform us.
We don't have to fight these battles alone. God is with us every step of the way. Now, as we conclude this video, I want to encourage you to keep going on this journey with us. If Ethan's story resonated with you, I invite you to explore
our playlist of videos that delve deeper into topics like overcoming temptation, embracing God's grace, and living a transformed life. These videos are full of wisdom, stories, and practical advice that will help you grow in faith and find the strength to overcome any challenge you may face. Click the link to dive deeper into these transformative topics, and don't miss out on the opportunity to take your spiritual journey to the next level. Every video in this playlist is designed to inspire, encourage, and equip you to live a life that's closer to God and filled with His peace. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What part of Ethan's story spoke to you the most? How has God's grace impacted your life, or is there something you're struggling with that you need to surrender to Him? Leave a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts, and your experience may be just the encouragement someone else needs. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss a video that could help you on your spiritual journey. Together, let's continue growing in faith and supporting each other as we walk the path of redemption. Thank you for being part of this community. You're not alone, and I can't wait to continue this journey with you. Take a step today, whether it's watching more videos, praying more, or simply reflecting on what God is calling you to do next. God's grace is waiting for you, and your transformation starts now.